It was a bright, sunny afternoon at the royal palace, where tourists from all over the world had gathered to see the sights. Among the busy crowd, one thing stood out: a royal guard, dressed in her crisp uniform, standing motionless at her post. Her sharp, disciplined appearance made her seem like she was carved from stone. She didn't move, didn't speak, and her face remained serious. For the tourists, she seemed like part of the show, a statue to take photos with. But, as always, there was something more beneath the surface that they didn't understand. The tourists, excited by the beautiful surroundings and the impressive architecture of the palace, noticed the guard standing by a tall pillar near the entrance. To them, she was just another part of the attraction. They were amazed at how still she stood, unmoving for what seemed like hours. Some tourists laughed among themselves, finding it amusing that she didn't react. Most people would get tired or fidgety, but not her. A group of tourists, led by a few who were feeling more adventurous, saw an opportunity for some fun. They had seen this type of thing before: people pranking soldiers or statues as a way to get a laugh and show off to their friends. It was all harmless, right? Just a funny joke. One of the tourists, a young man, took a step forward, looking around to make sure no one was watching. He grinned and whispered to his friends, "Let's tie her up, just for a laugh. She'll never even know what happened." His friends giggled at the idea, thinking it would be a good story to tell later. They began to gather some rope, one of the tourists pulling it out of a backpack. They carefully tied a loose knot around the guard's wrist, then another around the pillar. The guard, standing with perfect posture, didn't even flinch. The tourists continued to laugh, believing the guard was part of the joke. They even took a few pictures, thinking this would make for some funny photos to share with their friends back home. The group stood back for a moment, admiring their work. The guard was still perfectly still, almost as if she was part of the scene itself. But there was something about her calm, unwavering stance that sent a subtle message. Although the tourists didn't realize it, the guard wasn't simply standing still because she was indifferent. She had been trained for years to remain stoic, to never break her discipline, no matter what happened around her. What the tourists saw as a joke was not something she took lightly. She stood unmoved, her focus remaining on her post, even if they didn't understand the seriousness of her role. To the tourists, everything seemed fine. They laughed and joked with one another, thinking they had pulled off a harmless prank. But in the background, a few of the other royal guards stationed nearby began to notice what was going on. They had been trained to protect their fellow soldiers' dignity and the respect of the position they held. What seemed like a harmless joke to the tourists was quickly becoming something much more serious. As the laughter continued, the guards grew uneasy. The female royal guard remained completely still, not showing any signs of discomfort. But her colleagues, watching from afar, knew things were about to change. They could see the disrespect that was unfolding, and they were ready to put an end to it. The tourists had no idea that their innocent fun was about to take a very different turn. The tourists continued to laugh and take pictures, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. They thought the female royal guard was simply part of the entertainment, a stoic figure who wouldn't mind a little harmless prank. But what they didn't know was that the guard wasn't there to play games. She was there to do her job, and she took it seriously. The guard stood perfectly still, her posture straight and proud. She didn't move an inch, her eyes fixed ahead, as if nothing was happening around her. Despite the rope that had been tied around her wrist and the pole, she showed no signs of discomfort or struggle. Her training had taught her to remain calm no matter what, to never show weakness or emotion. It was a skill that had taken years to perfect. Her colleagues had often praised her for her ability to stay composed, no matter the situation. To the tourists, this only seemed to add to the fun. They saw her silence as part of the joke, thinking that maybe she was just pretending to be stuck or perhaps playing along. One of the tourists even joked, "Look at her, she's just standing there like a statue. We must be doing something right." Another tourist, a woman with a camera, leaned in closer to take a picture of the guard's face. She smiled and whispered, "She's not even reacting. This is going to be the best photo." As the group gathered around her, one tourist tugged at the rope a little, just to see if she would react. Still, the guard didn't budge. Her face remained calm, her eyes sharp and focused on her surroundings. If anything, she seemed more serious than ever. There was no anger, no frustration. She wasn't mad at the tourists, but she wasn't amused either. She simply stood, maintaining her professionalism as she had been trained to do. Her colleagues, who had been watching from a distance, exchanged worried glances. They could see that the situation was starting to get out of hand. The female guard's colleagues had been trained to recognize when a situation was becoming disrespectful, and this was quickly heading in that direction. They had been taught to maintain the dignity of their post at all costs, and this prank was not something they were willing to ignore. One of the senior guards, a tall and muscular man who had been stationed nearby, took a deep breath. He had seen his fair share of tourists trying to pull pranks, but this was different. The guard at the center of the prank was one of their own, and she deserved respect, not to be treated like a joke. Without saying a word, the senior guard began to walk toward the group of tourists, his face set in a serious expression. As he got closer, the tourists noticed him and stopped laughing. They hadn't expected anyone to step in. After all, it was just a harmless joke, right? But the senior guard wasn't smiling. In fact, his expression was colder than they had expected. The tourists, sensing that something was about to happen, looked at each other nervously. The fun they had been having was starting to feel less like a joke and more like a mistake. They didn't know it yet, but the consequences of their actions were about to unfold. As the senior guard moved toward the tourists, his eyes never left the scene in front of him. The tourists, who had been laughing and joking moments earlier, started to sense the shift in the air. The laughter died down, and the excitement that had filled the crowd began to fade. Something about the senior guard's presence made them realize that they had crossed a line, but they still didn't fully understand what they had done wrong. The senior guard was not alone. A few other guards, stationed around the area, had also noticed the situation. They had been keeping a close eye on the female guard ever since the tourists first started tying the rope. Royal guards were trained to protect their own, and while it was rare for tourists to cross boundaries like this, they were always ready to step in when needed. These guards were serious about their duties, and the respect for their colleagues was not something to be taken lightly. One of the younger guards, who had been standing at a distance, exchanged a look with his superior. He could tell that the situation wasn't just a harmless prank anymore. He could see that his colleague, the female guard, was still standing perfectly still, but the expression on her face was unreadable. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something more. She was simply carrying out her duty, and she wouldn't let anything break her composure. But the younger guard knew that she wouldn't have to deal with this alone. As the senior guard approached, the tourists finally began to quiet down. They had noticed the change in the atmosphere and could feel the tension growing. The senior guard's expression was firm, his face showing no signs of amusement. As he came closer, the tourists, unsure of what was happening, stepped back a little. They didn't want to make things worse, but they were also too nervous to move away completely. One of the tourists, a young man who had been the first to suggest tying the rope, spoke up nervously. We were just having some fun. It's nothing serious," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. The senior guard didn't respond at first. He simply stopped in front of the group, his eyes scanning them with a cool intensity. "I'm afraid this is not a joke," the senior guard said, his voice calm but firm. "You have disrespected a fellow soldier and the entire royal guard. We do not take this lightly." The tourists fell silent. They hadn't expected to be scolded so seriously. To them, it had all seemed harmless, just a little fun to take back home as a funny story. But now, standing in front of the senior guard, they began to realize how wrong they had been. The younger guard stepped forward, his tone serious. She's a royal guard. She is here to do her duty. And that deserves respect, he added. The tourists stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. The fun had turned into a lesson, and it was clear now that their actions had been out of line. The senior guard's gaze softened, but there was still no sign of laughter. "Untie her," he instructed, his voice now filled with authority. Immediately. The tourists, now understanding the seriousness of the situation, scrambled to remove the rope. But it was clear that the damage had been done. The female guard, still standing perfectly still, didn't show any sign of resentment. She remained professional, letting the situation unfold around her without a word. Her colleagues, however, would make sure the tourists learned a valuable lesson. As the tourists fumbled with the rope, trying to untie the female guard, the senior guard stood silently, watching them carefully. The weight of his gaze seemed to make them even more nervous. They were no longer smiling or joking. Their earlier excitement had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of embarrassment. They were now realizing the full extent of their mistake. The tourists, still unsure of what exactly was happening, rushed to free the guard, but their hands trembled slightly as they worked. The young man who had suggested the prank muttered to his friends, "We didn't mean anything by it. I didn't think it would be like this." His voice lacked the earlier confidence, his words sounding small and apologetic. The senior guard didn't offer any comfort. He wasn't there to soften the situation. He was there to make sure this was dealt with properly. His eyes stayed locked on the tourists, and his expression remained stern. The young tourist fumbled with the rope, struggling to untie the knots, but the task wasn't as easy as he had imagined. Each second felt like it stretched longer, and with each delay, the weight of their actions sank deeper in their minds. The female guard, still standing perfectly still. The air around the scene had grown heavy with silence. The tourists, now fully aware of their mistake, were quiet and uneasy as they finished untying the rope from the female guard. Her colleagues, still standing nearby, watched with serious expressions. They weren't angry, but they were disappointed. They had a duty to protect the dignity of their post, and what had happened just now was unacceptable. The tourists may have thought it was harmless fun, but to the guards, it was a matter of respect. The senior guard took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the group of tourists. He could see that some of them were genuinely regretful, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Others, however, still seemed confused, not fully understanding why this was such a big deal. But he wasn't going to let it slide. He had seen too many tourists treat their duties as a joke, and this had to be addressed before it became a pattern. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the group. "You may not understand the seriousness of your actions, but we will make sure you do," he said, his voice calm but firm. His words weren't meant to be harsh. They were meant to make the tourists realize that there were consequences for their behavior. This is not a game. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances. They could tell that the mood had shifted completely. The playful atmosphere from earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet tension. One of the tourists, the young man who had suggested the prank, finally spoke up. "We didn't mean to disrespect anyone," he said, his voice low. "We thought she was just part of the attraction." The senior guard nodded slowly, acknowledging the explanation but not accepting the excuse. "The guard you tied up is not part of any attraction," he said, his tone steady. "She is a soldier, a royal guard who has worked hard to earn her place. You treated her as if she was a toy, something to laugh at. That is unacceptable." The young man lowered his head, his face turning red with embarrassment. He hadn't realized the full significance of what they had done. His friends, too, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. They shuffled awkwardly, not sure what to say next. The senior guard continued, his eyes scanning each of them. "We protect this country and its people with pride. That includes the royal guards, who serve with honor every day. You disrespected not just one person, but the entire force." At that moment, the female guard, still standing silently, stepped forward. She had been untied but hadn't moved from her spot. Her calm demeanor remained, and she looked directly at the tourists. There was no anger in her expression, just a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Her colleagues had made their point, but now it was her turn to add something. "You are forgiven," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But this will serve as a lesson for all of you. What may seem like a harmless joke can have lasting effects." Her words were simple, but they carried a powerful message. The tourists stood still, humbled. They had not expected forgiveness, but her words made them feel even more regretful. They had made a mistake, and they now understood the importance of respecting those who served in positions of honor. The senior guard nodded to the female guard, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he said to her, before turning back to the tourists. "You will be escorted out now. We will ensure this does not happen again." As the tourists walked away, their heads hung low. They couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. What started as a simple joke had turned into a serious lesson in respect. They left with more than just a story to tell. They left with a newfound understanding of the honor and responsibility carried by the royal guards. And they knew they would never forget this moment. The tourists shuffled away, their heads low, their footsteps quiet. What had started as an innocent joke was now a heavy lesson they would never forget. The royal guards watched them leave, their expressions stern but composed. The female guard, who had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, finally relaxed her posture as the situation came to a close. Her colleagues, still standing at attention, exchanged looks that said more than words could. The tourists were escorted to the nearest exit, with the senior guard walking behind them, making sure they left the area. The moment they were out of sight, the tension around the guards began to ease, but they knew the message had been sent. They had protected their own, stood their ground, and reminded the tourists of the importance of respect. Back at the Royal Guard station, the senior guard turned to the female guard. "You handled yourself well," he said with a nod. "We're all proud of how you stayed calm." The female guard nodded in return, her face still as composed as ever. "Thank you," she replied softly. It wasn't easy, but it was important. The younger guards, who had been watching from a distance, gathered around as well. "You were amazing," one of them said. "You didn't let them see any weakness, even though they were pulling that prank right in front of you." The female guard gave a small smile, the first one anyone had seen from her that day. "It's part of the job," she said. "We stand here, day in and day out, representing something bigger than ourselves. We have to be stronger than any joke or prank that comes our way." Her colleagues nodded, respecting her words. They all knew that being a royal guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about maintaining dignity and showing strength in the face of disrespect, no matter where it came from. As the day wore on, the guards resumed their usual duties. The tourists' prank might have been over, but the lesson they had learned would stick with them. They wouldn't be forgetting the royal guards anytime soon. The female guard returned to her post, standing tall once more, her eyes focused ahead. She knew that the tourists wouldn't return, and that was probably for the best. But in a way, she was glad the situation had happened. It reminded her of the importance of her role and the respect that was due to everyone in her position. Meanwhile, the tourists were back at their hotel, sitting in uncomfortable silence as they reflected on their actions. They had come to the palace expecting a fun adventure, but now they understood that what they had done wasn't something to laugh about. They had disrespected someone who had worked hard to be where they were, and that realization was more humbling than they could have imagined. Later that evening, one of the tourists, the young man who had started the prank, picked up his phone. He began typing a message, his fingers hesitating over the screen before he pressed send. "I'm really sorry," he wrote. "We didn't mean any harm, but I understand now. What we did was wrong." He looked at the message for a moment, then pressed send. Even though he was far from the palace, he knew that the female guard and all the royal guards had taught him a valuable lesson that day, one that would stick with him for a long time. The next morning, The tourists were sitting together in the hotel lobby, their earlier embarrassment still fresh in their minds. It was hard to believe that just a day ago, they had been laughing and joking at the expense of the Royal Guard, thinking it was harmless fun. Now all of them felt uneasy, replaying the events over and over in their minds. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had done something deeply disrespectful. As they sat in silence, the young man who had started the prank, still feeling the weight of his actions, spoke up. "I just can't stop thinking about it," he said quietly. "I never imagined it would lead to this. I feel terrible about what we did." The others nodded, their faces reflecting the same regret. They had come to see the royal palace and enjoy their time in a foreign country, but now they understood that they had disrespected not just a soldier, but an entire institution. The realization that their actions had consequences was a sobering one. "We didn't understand at first," one of the tourists admitted. "It was supposed to be funny, but now, I get it. She's not just a guard. She's someone who takes pride in her duty. We were disrespecting that." The young man nodded. "Yeah, they protect the country, and we thought it was just some performance. We didn't think about the fact that they're real people with real responsibilities." Their conversation was interrupted by the hotel staff, who informed them that they had received a message. It was from the Royal Guard, or rather, from someone representing the palace. The tourists all looked at each other nervously. Had they been reported? Were there consequences they hadn't anticipated? One of the group took a deep breath and opened the message. The message read, "We acknowledge your apology and your understanding. The lesson you learned yesterday is one that will stay with you, and we hope it helps you appreciate the importance of respect. You are welcome to return to the palace, but remember that respect for those who serve is essential." For a moment, they sat in silence. The apology they had written to the Royal Guard had been received. But more than that, they realized something important. They had been given a second chance. This was not something that happened often. They had learned their lesson, and now they had the opportunity to make things right. The young man who had initiated the prank spoke again, his voice filled with sincerity. "We need to go back and show them that we understand," he said, "not just by saying it, but by showing it in our actions. We owe them that." The others agreed. They knew they couldn't undo what had happened, but they could at least make an effort to demonstrate respect. They decided to return to the palace, hoping that their sincere apology would be accepted. When they arrived at the gates of the palace, the royal guards were still stationed, standing tall in their usual positions. The tourists walked up to them, heads bowed, feeling the weight of their previous mistake. The senior guard, who had been part of the group that had intervened the day before, saw them coming. He watched them closely, his face expressionless. The young man stepped forward, looking directly at the senior guard. "We want to apologize," he said. "We were wrong yesterday, and we're truly sorry for what we did. We understand now that we disrespected not just your colleague, but all of you. Please know that we've learned from our mistake." The senior guard studied them for a moment before nodding. "Your apology is noted," he said. "It's clear that you've learned something important. You are free to visit the palace again. But remember, respect is earned and given to all who serve." The tourists, relieved, nodded gratefully. They had learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a lesson in respect, responsibility, and the importance of understanding the roles others play in the world. As they walked away, they felt a weight lifted off their shoulders. They knew that while they couldn't erase their mistake, they had taken the right steps to make amends. The royal guards had taught them something more valuable than any souvenir. They had shown them the true meaning of honor. The days that followed were quieter for the tourists. After their apology, they spent the rest of their vacation reflecting on the events at the royal palace. They could not shake the image of the female royal guard standing tall, her composure never once breaking, despite the prank. The lesson they had learned remained with them every time they passed by a guard or saw someone in a uniform. It was clear that respect was not just something you gave out of duty. It was something earned by those who dedicated their lives to serving others. Back at the palace, life continued as usual for the royal guards. The female guard returned to her post, as she did every day, standing tall and unwavering. Her colleagues, while they had been concerned about the prank, were proud of how she had handled the situation. She had shown the world what it meant to be a royal guard, calm, composed, and dignified. The senior guard, who had taken charge of the situation the day before, observed her from a distance. He had worked with many guards over the years, but he knew that there was something special about her. She had remained calm and professional in the face of disrespect. She had been tied to a pole as a joke, yet there she was again, standing at attention, as if nothing had happened. That was the true strength of a royal guard. As the day went on, tourists continued to pass through the gates, admiring the palace's architecture, taking photos, and marveling at the guards' impeccable uniforms. But no one seemed to pay much attention to the female guard anymore. She had become just another part of the scene, just another figure to photograph. But to her colleagues, she was more than that. She was a symbol of resilience. She was a reminder of what it meant to be a royal guard, dedicated, unshaken, and ever vigilant. The tourists who had apologized now knew the value of respect. They had learned that behind every royal guard was a person, a dedicated individual who gave up their time, their comfort, and sometimes even their safety for the protection of others. They had realized, perhaps a little too late, that what they had taken for granted was something that should be respected and admired. Their mistake had been painful, but it had opened their eyes to the hard work and discipline that went into being part of such an esteemed force. As for the female guard, she continued to stand at her post, ever the professional. She didn't need anyone to see her as anything more than what she was, a royal guard doing her job. She didn't seek praise or recognition, but what she had unknowingly taught the tourists was something far greater than any thanks or admiration could offer. She had taught them the importance of honor, of respecting those who served, and of understanding that sometimes the greatest strength lies in silence and composure. When the day came to an end, the female guard left her post and returned to the barracks, just as she had done countless times before. She knew that tomorrow she would once again take her place in front of the palace gates. She would remain strong, unwavering, and unshaken, ready for whatever came next, and no prank or disrespectful tourist could ever change that. As the days passed, life at the palace returned to its usual rhythm. The female royal guard resumed her duties with the same level of focus and dedication that she always showed. Every morning, she stood at her post, her back straight, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had learned long ago that the job was not just about being physically present. It was about maintaining discipline, respect, and honor, no matter the circumstances. The tourists who had once made light of her role had long since returned home, but the lessons they had learned from that day stayed with them. They had sent letters to the palace, expressing their sincere apologies and gratitude for the opportunity to understand the true meaning of respect. The royal guards, including the female guard, had been mentioned in those letters, though none of them sought recognition. They simply did their jobs as they always had, with quiet professionalism. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, the senior guard approached the female guard as she stood at her post. He had been keeping an eye on her over the past few days, admiring her calmness and resilience. Today, however, he noticed something different about her. There was a subtle change in her posture, a softening of her expression, as if the weight of the situation had finally begun to settle. "You've been handling things well," the senior guard said, his voice warm but respectful. "I know it wasn't easy, but you showed everyone what it means to be a royal guard." The female guard nodded, her gaze still focused ahead. "It's part of the job," she replied. "We serve with dignity, no matter what happens around us." The senior guard smiled slightly, understanding the depth of her words. "You're right, but not everyone can do what you did. It's easy to lose composure when things get difficult, but you didn't. You stood firm, and you taught others a valuable lesson. even if they didn't realize it at the time. The female guard glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the horizon. I didn't do it for anyone else. I did it because it's what we're trained to do. It's our duty to remain strong, to never waver, no matter the situation. The senior guard considered her words for a moment. That's the heart of a true royal guard. You showed not just strength, but grace under pressure. Not many can do that. She didn't respond immediately, but her expression softened. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of pride in her work. It wasn't about the attention or recognition. It was about knowing that she had stayed true to her values, that she had protected the honor of her position. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the royal guard returned to her post, her mind clear and focused. She had proven to herself that no prank, no joke, no disrespect could shake her resolve. She was a royal guard, and her strength was not in her uniform or her position, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had a purpose, and that purpose was to serve with dignity, no matter the challenges that came her way. And as she stood there, watching the last light of the day fade, she knew that no matter what happened tomorrow or the next day, she would continue to serve with the same unwavering commitment. The lesson had been learned, and the guard had done her duty. Her strength was not just in her ability to stand still, but in her ability to remain unshaken, no matter the trials she faced. And that, in the end, was what made her a true royal guard.